Hi. If you're still here, you probably care about stopping anti-Semitism. A lot of people and organizations in recent years have worried about how to spot it, and certainly there are some classics that it'll help to be aware of.
This fabulous creature is Oliver Thorne, aka PhilosophyTube, the man who proves that you can find popularity while doing philosophy on YouTube, and thus a constant reminder to me that the reason that I'm not successful at it must be because I suck. Lately, PhilosophyTube has uploaded a video which tackles antisemitism, and I was glad to see it, because it's a topic that is being silenced by YouTube. I don't know if you are aware, but many Jewish YouTubers, including myself, have had videos removed when we try to talk about the subject. To date, I have had only 4 of my videos removed by YouTube, and the thing that they all have in common is that they attack antisemitism. So any attempt to do so should be commended. This topic is too important to let them silence it, so here I go again, trying to talk about it. You better watch it before it gets taken down. Now Oliver, as always, put a lot of work into his video. He discusses the important philosophical texts on the subject, and also shows how antisemitism manifests itself. The video is as good as you'd expect from someone who doesn't live the issue on a daily basis, and a few years ago I would have called it a good effort, and moved on. But in this day and age, when Jews are once again the target of anti-Semitic violence in the West, I have to say, not good enough. Not good enough. So Oliver, and his fans, if you truly want to understand today's antisemitism and help the fight against it, I ask that you watch this video. The first criticism that you can level at Thorne is that he uses antisemitism to promote his communist worldview, even suggesting that a communist revolution can solve the problem. But I don't begrudge him that. It's okay to promote your worldview, as long as you also take the issue itself seriously. Oli does try to do that. He focuses mainly on right-wing antisemitism, but he does acknowledge that there are other kinds. However, he doesn't really get the dynamic of how they support each other. Nowadays, there are 4 main types of antisemitism that are the problem. There's right-wing antisemitism, there's Muslim antisemitism, there's Black American antisemitism, and there's left-wing antisemitism. The first 3 are the ones that are doing the violence, but the 4th, the left-wing type, is the one that is feeding and breeding the other 3, and because of that, it is actually the biggest problem at the moment. Then again, it is also the one that we can do something about. As a leftist, this is the type of antisemitism that you should focus on. PhilosophyTube does address left-wing antisemitism. He talks about manifestations of it in the past, and also in the present, but the anecdotes that he provides to show present left-wing antisemitism show that he doesn't really understand how deep the problem goes. To his credit, he is at least aware that a lot of it has to do with how left-wingers talk about Israel.
Obviously, people need to be able to criticize what the Israeli government does sometimes. People need to be able to criticize what any government does. It's kind of important for democracy. But watch out! Wherever there are people criticizing Israel in a legit way, you will find others sneaking anti-Semitism in.
Yes, indeed. But when he expands on it, you can see that Oli doesn't fully understand how this works, how alleged criticism of the Israeli government is actually a cover for antisemitism. He says that he consulted Jews while making the video, but my guess is that he did not consult Israelis. The problem with consulting only diaspora Jews is that they don't know much about Israel, so it is hard for them to detect this type of antisemitism. So, I'm going to show you an example now. And since we are on YouTube, I shall remain on YouTube. We are going to watch a video by a left-wing YouTube channel, a big and influential one, to show you what left-wing antisemitism looks like and why it is so poisonous and harmful.
So Israel has a twofold immigration problem these days. First of all, there's refugees from Sudan that are in the country, and there's been a lot of agitation over that. Israelis protesting, marching, sometimes yelling at Sudanese women and men and calling them a lot of bad words. Basically say, Sudanese, go home, you're not welcome here, you're criminals. In one instance, shouting at them, you're whores, etc.
This is a Young Turks video from 2013. Back then, Israel had a problem with many Africans who infiltrated its southern border, seeking a better life. Since then, Israel has built a fence that solved the issue, but at the time these illegal immigrants were causing a lot of problems, and there was animosity towards them. Let's see what Cenk Uygur makes of it.
Now, of course, there's an irony there. Israel was created because nobody would take in the Jews during the Holocaust.
Bullshit. But we will get to that later.
So that seems like an excellent justification, and the one that is used most often, understandably so, right? Now, the Sudanese have not been treated well, not just in Sudan, the ones that are fleeing, but also in Egypt and other Muslim countries as well. And a lot of them are Christian, and they're fleeing because they're being persecuted because of religious reasons. Now, you would hope that of all the countries in the world, Israel would understand that best.
The expectation that, just because we suffered persecution, every Jew should act like an angel, is a really superficial way of looking at the world, and does not bring human nature into account. It already raises a suspicion that Cenk doesn't think of Jews as humans, but never mind that. The question is, why is Cenk talking about it at all? What he describes here is happening in every country that has illegal immigration problems, and usually the public reaction includes incidents that are a lot worse than calling the immigrants bad names. So why did Cenk choose to focus on Israel, of all countries? Well, because he isn't done.
But that's actually the least of their immigration problems. They also have 130,000 Ethiopians.
Yes, and that's not an immigration problem. The Jewish community in Ethiopia has been around for many years. Some say it goes all the way back to the 7th century BC. In the 1980s there was famine in Ethiopia, so Israel decided to save all the Ethiopian Jews and bring them to Israel. It was a complicated operation. It took a few years to complete, but eventually it got all the Jews out. So far from being an immigration problem, this is actually a story in which the Israeli government, with the full support of the Israeli people, spent a lot of resources to bring all the Ethiopian Jews back to their homeland.
Now, in this case, the Ethiopians are Jewish, so it doesn't really matter. It's a Jewish state, so they should be welcome, right? Well, not exactly. The health ministry has just admitted that they were doing forced sterilization of Ethiopian women, even though they're Jewish, as they were coming into the country.
Okay, where did Cenk come up with this idea? Well, as I said, all the Ethiopian Jews were brought to Israel, but that wasn't the end of the story. They have family members that were left behind, who aren't Jewish but they still want to bring them along. Israeli law grants automatic citizenship to any Jew, but if you are not a Jew, you have to go through a bureaucratic process. So these Ethiopians have to wait in a camp in Addis Ababa until the process is done and they get the okay to come to Israel. And there are people there who help them. There is an organization called The Joint, made of Jewish volunteers, dedicated to help Jews around the world. The Joint sent its people to the Addis Ababa camp to help prepare these Ethiopians for life in Israel, a first world country, which is very different from the third world life that they knew. One thing that they told them is that having 6 children per family, as they were used to, will make it hard for them to succeed in Israel. This is good advice, but they went too far. Apparently, they pressured them to take birth control shots, and sometimes even tricked them to take these shots without telling them what they are about. In other words, they acted out of good intentions, but used unethical methods. The upshot was that some of the women kept on asking doctors to give them these birth control shots even after they came to Israel, apparently not realizing what they do. This is how it eventually came out, and there was a public outcry about it. So the Israeli government issued a directive for Israeli doctors to make sure that Ethiopian women asking for these shots know what they are about. This is the story. Now note how Cenk reports on it. First of all, he doesn't say birth control, but uses the word sterilization, invoking the darkest regimes humanity has known. Then he says this.
The health ministry has just admitted that they were doing forced sterilization.
Who's they? They are the Joint people. And they were not exactly forcing women, although what they did was wrong. But Cenk makes it sound like it was the Israeli government that was behind it, thus portraying it as an evil government.
Now, thank God the sterilization is not permanent, but it did last for a long time.
The shot is effective for 3 months, but he makes it sound a lot longer, doesn't he?
In fact, over the last 10 years, the birth rate among Ethiopians in Israel has dropped by 50%.
Indeed, in the first years after they came to the country, The birth rate among Ethiopians remained steady at around 6 children per family. But then, within a decade, it dropped to 3 children per family, which is the Israeli average. It shows how well the Ethiopians integrated in Israeli society. But Cenk manipulates this stat to portray Israel as sinister.
Now, you don't have to speculate as to why. As I just told you, Israel's health minister has admitted they did the program.
Israel admitted no such thing. There was an investigation, and it found that no one in the government had knowledge that this was going on. After twisting the story, Cenk is now building a lie upon a lie.
And in fact, he sent out a note saying not to renew prescriptions for Depo-Provera for women of Ethiopian origin if for any reason there is concern that they might not understand the ramifications of the treatment. I don't think the issue was that they didn't understand the ramifications of the treatment. The issue was as they were coming in, they were told they had to get that shot.
Yeah, the reason why Cenk thinks that is that he already has a preconceived notion that Israel is evil, and so he assumes that it must be government policy. He is exposing his own bigotry.
Sometimes they were lied to and said, oh yeah, it's a vaccination and it's going to help you with your health. One of the women that were interviewed, the 30 different ones saying the same thing, was quoted as saying, quote, they told us they are inoculations. They told us people who frequently give birth suffer. We took it every 3 months. We said we didn't want to.
Again, who's they in this quote? They are the joint people. But that's not the impression that you get from Cenk's report, is it? Now, you might say, okay, so Cenk has a prejudice and thinks that the Israeli government is evil. Maybe it's just because he doesn't like governments in general, not because he has bigoted notions about Jews. But remember how this video started. It started with an unrelated story about rejection of black people by the Israeli society. That story provided the background to this story about the alleged actions of the Israeli government. So what Cenk did here was to take a news story about the misguided actions of some Jewish individuals, actions that were promptly condemned by the Israeli public and the Israeli government, and twist it into a story about how Jews are racist to such an extent that they elect an evil government that carries out policies associated with the worst regimes in history. And this is what makes this an anti-Semitic video. This is an anti-Semitic blood libel, in every sense of the word.
Look, Israel's not the only country with racism. I mean, look at the United States of America. We had slavery here, and problems of racism still exist in this country, as well as many other countries.
So here's the part where Cenk tries to back off a little, realizing the inflammatory nature of what he just did. And yes, every country has racism, but not every country has a government that forcibly sterilizes people because of their race. To suggest that Israel is doing so is to suggest that Israel is evil, and to hint that it is done with the backing of the population is to suggest that Jews don't just have a problem of racism like everyone else, but that they are an evil group of people. Now, if this was a single incident in which Cenk was being anti-Semitic, I would give him a pass. But this is far from being the case. Whenever Cenk makes a video about Israel, he will usually twist the story to portray Jews as evil. This is not even the most egregious example. Is he consciously doing it? No, I don't believe he is. Cenk is a certain type of an anti-Semite who doesn't know that he is an anti-Semite. This type of antisemitism can be cured if you point the bigot to their bigotry. Unfortunately, the left-wing milieu that Cenk runs in has many people who are like him, so they all reinforce each other's unconscious antisemitism. And this is why left-wing antisemitism is such a problem. The other types of antisemitism are easily recognizable and are marginalized in the West. But left-wing antisemitism runs rampant in the left and can be found in big left-wing media outlets. The lie about the Ethiopian Jews is just one of an entire web of lies about Israel that are spread by the left-wing media. Examples include the claim that interfaith marriage is illegal in Israel, that gay marriage is illegal in Israel, that only Jews can immigrate to Israel, that Israel runs DNA tests to determine if someone is part of the Jewish race, that minorities living in Israel don't have citizenship, that Israel has laws that discriminate against non-Jews, and many other such lies designed to portray Israel as a non-liberal country, or even as an evil country. It's all bullshit, but this bullshit is then consumed by millions of people, and even finds its way into mainstream media. What harm does that do? Well, let's go back to the Young Turks video that we just watched and look at the comment section. Most comments express shock, but some also start to ask questions. For instance, if Israel is so evil, why does the US government support it? Why does the media support it? When people ponder on such questions, they start to look for answers, and then someone might suggest to them to look up the Zionist agenda. The Zionist agenda, in right-wing and Muslim antisemitism, is the idea that Jews want to take over the world, and they are doing so by secretly controlling the governments and the media. Well, thinks the uninformed viewer, if Israel is so evil, as Cenk just showed us, and yet it is supported by the US government and media, maybe they are being controlled by Jews. And once people go down this path, they can also believe Muslim anti-Semites who tell them that European Jews are not real Jews, black anti-Semites who tell them that today's Jews are evil usurpers of the original Jews, and Christian anti-Semites who tell them that Jews are the spawn of Satan. If you want to effectively tackle today's antisemitism, you first of all need to understand this dynamic. People in the West today are not born and raised to be anti-Semites. They have to be led to it, and the left-wing media is the gateway which leads most of them down that path. So, especially if you are a leftist, you have to start the cleanup with the lies that are being perpetuated by the left-wing media. And to effectively do that, you have to understand where left-wing antisemitism comes from. People like Cenk are the product of decades of propaganda. There are two big lies that have been promoted by anti-Semites in recent decades. One lie, promoted by right-wing and Muslim anti-Semites, is denial of the Holocaust. The other lie, promoted by left-wing and Muslim anti-Semites, is the erasing of Jewish history, and thus of Jewish identity. And the latter have been a lot more successful in spreading their lie, to the point where people are completely ignorant of the story of the Jewish people, and are thus unable to not become unknowingly anti-Semitic.
Zionism is the idea that Jewish people should have their own country, though of course how it should be run is another debate. A Zionist person might say, look, Jews have been persecuted all over the world. In 1938, German Jews had their citizenship taken away, and there was this big international thing called the Evian Conference, where all the other nations of the world refused to take the Jewish refugees. As a result, Jewish people got stuck in Germany, and we know what happened next, so we need a strong country under majority Jewish control to make sure that never happens again. And in response, an anti-Zionist person might say something like, okay, cool, but did you have to put the country there? Because there were already people living there and you can't just kill them. I mean, Israel came about because in 1917, Britain did a colonialism and invaded Palestine and supported the Zionist project, at least in part because they wanted to get rid of the Jewish people in Britain. They were like, oh, well, I suppose we'll just take all of the Jews and send them out to Palestine. And it wasn't a universally popular move. So in 1948, they were like, oh, it appears we've buggered it. Is that the king calling me? I'm sorry, I have to go, everybody. And then the Palestinians were like, can we have our land back? And the UN went, oh, yeah, but that's Israel now, though. I mean, we've already had all the maps printed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Oliver, but in the way that you have just framed this imaginary debate, you have essentially erased my identity and the history of my people. It's hard to blame you. Even some Jews have fallen victim to the propaganda and think that this is what happened. But this lie is the basis of much of today's antisemitism. To resist antisemitism, you have to free yourself of this lie, and for that you have to be at least somewhat familiar with the story of the Jews. So, let me give you the Cliff Notes. The Jews are a nation that was formed in the land of Israel around 3,000 years ago. Their country was first called Israel, then Judea, and it existed for more than 1,000 years. At times it was sovereign, at other times it was occupied by a foreign empire, but it was always the land of the Jews. Then, in the 1st century BC, it was occupied and colonized by the Roman Empire. The Jews fiercely resisted the occupation, and the Romans eventually decided to destroy them completely. In the year 70 AD, they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the center of Jewish spiritual life, and in 135 AD they erased Judea off the map and called the country Palestine instead. And they made life extremely hard for the Jews, forcing many of them into exile. Palestine never became a country. It was a province in the Roman Empire, and then it was part of other empires. After a few centuries of pagan and Christian occupation, it was occupied and colonized by Muslim empires. The Muslims usually didn't call it Palestine, but they didn't call it Israel either. In fact, they did everything they could to erase what was left of the occupied Jewish minority. They built a mosque over the ruins of the Jewish temple, thus ensuring that it can never be rebuilt. They did not allow Jews to pray in the holiest sites, and they kept the Jews in the status of dhimmis. And yet, the Jews refused to give up on their identity. The nation was obliterated and scattered, but they still had their religion, and through their religion, they kept their national identity alive. Many religious rituals were set to remind the Jews that they are a nation, and that their homeland is Israel. A Jewish minority always kept on living in the land of Israel, under occupation and oppression by the different empires, to keep the ember burning for the day that we can return and be sovereign again. In every generation, Jews immigrated to Israel into much harsher conditions than what they knew, to die in their homeland, but they were never allowed to return to it as a nation. Why did the world deny the rights from the Jews to return to the homeland? Well, first of all, since the Akkadian Empire of the 23rd century BC, the world was ruled by empires, and their occupation of other people's land was seen as legal. Secondly, the Christians and the Muslims wanted the Holy Land to themselves. Third, the Catholic Church believed that a Jew was condemned to forever be wandering without a home, as punishment for rejecting Christ. In short, there was no one to support the Jewish claim to their homeland, and they were never strong enough to do anything about it. In the 19th century, following the awakening of the national movements in Europe, the Jews started thinking that maybe their dream of returning to their homeland can finally come true, and the Zionist movement was born. Their homeland, however, was not in Europe, but rather in a region controlled by an empire. Zionism, in other words, was one of the earliest anti-imperialist movements. The land of Israel, at the time, was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks did not allow land to be sold to Jews, but they were also easily corruptible, and the European Jews, in the 19th century, started to make money. So they could bribe officials and buy land, and they started to go back to Israel and rebuild it. Then, in 1917, the Brits defeated the Turks and conquered the land, and they decided to finally, after almost 2,000 years, right a historical wrong and give the land of Israel back to its indigenous people.
Israel came about because in 1917, Britain did a colonialism and invaded Palestine and supported the Zionist project.
Where to begin? First of all, the country was not called Palestine before the British conquered it. There was no country. It was just a small part of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, this was actually an anti-colonialist move by the British. They did not declare the land of Israel part of the British Empire, but were there only as overseers. In 1922, the League of Nations agreed that the Jews should be allowed to finally return to their homeland and form their national home there, and gave Britain mandate to oversee this transition. We are beginning to see the emergence of a new Western world, a Western world that is beginning to turn its back on imperialism. Unfortunately, this was not the case elsewhere around the globe. The Muslims were still very much in the imperialist mindset, and refused to give up parts of the empire that they created. The land of Israel, according to Islam, should be under Muslim rule, so they could not accept giving it back to the Jews. The British did, however, perform one act of colonialism in this instance. Instead of calling the land by the name that its indigenous people gave it, which is either Israel or Judea or Zion, they went back to its European colonialist name and named it Palestine. A lot of problems could have been averted if they just called it by its real name. The fact that they called it Palestine is what enables today's anti-Semites to claim that Israel was built upon the ruins of another country. And at the time, what it did was that it gave the local Arab population the grounds to start referring to themselves as Palestinians, and claim that they are a nation, and that the country should belong to them. In 1920, the Palestinians started a campaign of terror against the Jews, trying to prevent the formation of the intended Jewish home. This campaign carries on to this day, 100 years later. The borders of Palestine that the Brits drew in 1917 looked like this. All of this was intended to be the Jewish national home. This is quite generous. It is bigger than the historic Israel. But this generosity didn't last long. By the time the League of Nations voted on it in 1922, the Brits already gave almost 80% of the original Palestine to the Arabs to form the Kingdom of Jordan. Now, Jordan does include part of our historic homeland, and the Jews were upset about it, but they accepted it. The more important parts are the ones that are west of the Jordan River. So now, only this was Palestine, the intended homeland of the Jews. The League of Nations stressed that the rights of the local Arabs should not be harmed, and there was no reason why they should have. At that time, there were about 1 million Arabs living in so-called Palestine, and about 15 million Jews around the world waiting to have a homeland to return to. So it would have been no problem creating a Jewish majority, and the Arabs would then simply live as a minority. But the Arabs did this math as well, so they started their terrorism to dissuade Jews from coming. The Brits, shamefully, folded before the violence, and put a quota on the number of Jews that were allowed to return each year. But the Jews kept on coming, finding ways around the limitations. The Arabs, in response, increased the violence, and in 1939, the British betrayed their mandate and completely closed the gates before Jewish immigration, which meant that, at the time Jews needed it the most, the land of Israel was blocked before them. At this point, from the Jewish point of view, the British became just one more in a line of foreign empires that occupied our country. After World War II was over, the Jews started to fight against British occupation and increased their immigration drive. In 1947, the Brits had enough and returned their mandate to the UN. The UN then had to vote about the fate of the land, and the offer was to partition it into 2 states, one Jewish and one Palestinian. The General Assembly voted in favor of the partition plan in November 1947 and gave the Brits 6 months to clear out. Now, at this juncture, there were about 1.5 million Arabs living in so-called Palestine, and about 10 million Jews around the world waiting to have their homeland again. You'd expect the partition plan to reflect these numbers, but no, it was divided about 50-50. The area that the Jews got was slightly bigger, but most of it was desert land. So from this, all that was now left for the Jews is this, about 10% of the original offer. It was a raw deal any way you want to look at it, but the Jews were happy to get any land after 2,000 years of exile. Also, they needed to rebuild after the Holocaust, so they begrudgingly accepted and started to prepare for sovereignty. The Arabs, on the other hand, could not accept giving up any part of their historic empire, and vowed to not let it happen. While the Jews were organizing, the Palestinians were busy creating violence and chaos to make it seem like the proposed 2-state solution is impossible, and the neighboring Arab states declared that they are going to invade Israel and wipe it off the map. Now, remember, we said that the UN vote took place in the General Assembly, but General Assembly votes are not legally binding. To make the partition plan part of international law, the Security Council had to vote on it. And, due to the Arab threats, the Security Council vote was delayed, as the international community tried to find a solution that will appease the Arabs. But the British announced that they were going to leave anyway, and did. Once again, a few short years after the Holocaust, the world left the Jews to fend for themselves against a genocidal threat. On May 1948, the Brits left. On the next day, Israel declared sovereignty, and 7 Arab countries declared war on it, and sent their armies to attack it. If they would have succeeded in destroying Israel, that would have been the end of the Zionist movement. Since the partition plan did not have legal status, the Jews would have had no legal claim for the land, and would have to wait for many more years until they could try again. But the Jews won, in a bloody war that cost them 1% of the Jewish population. Not only that, but they even expanded Israel's borders, creating borders that could be defended against the Arab hostility. And most countries in the world eventually came to recognize it in its new borders. So Oliver, when you say...
So, in 1948 they were like, oh, it appears we've buggered it. Is that the king calling me? I'm sorry, I have to go, everybody. And then the Palestinians were like, can we have our land back? And the UN went, oh, yeah, but that's Israel now, though. I mean, we've already had all the maps printed.
Do you understand now how offensive you are being? Not only did the UN plan take away half of the land that was originally intended for the Jews, not only did they not give it legal status, thus giving the Arabs the opportunity to destroy the chances of Jewish sovereignty for good, Not only did the world do nothing to protect the Jews against Arab imperialism, leaving them to fight for themselves in a war that cost them 1% of the population, but now you come and claim that it was the fucking UN that gave the land to the Jews. When was the last time your country lost 1% of its population in a war, Oli? I'll tell you when. In World War II. Now, imagine that after all that sacrifice and pain, someone would have come today and said that the Germans wanted the British Isles for themselves, but they didn't get it because the UN told them that they can't have it. Wouldn't you feel like they are spitting on the graves of the people who died in that war?
An anti-Zionist person might say something like, okay, cool, but did you have to put the country there?
What kind of a dumbass question is this? The country is there because this has been our homeland for over 3,000 years. Almost every nation in the world has a homeland, and it is an integral part of its national identity. For the Jewish nation, it is even stronger, as its emotional connection to the land of Israel has a mystical dimension. Since the 6th century BC, Jews referred to immigration to Israel as ascension, and immigrating from it as descension. In the 2,000 years of exile, Jews would pray every day, 3 times a day, to one day return to Zion and be a sovereign nation again. In the centuries of Ottoman Empire occupation, living conditions in the land of Israel became so hard for the Jews that they could not sustain themselves, and Jews from all over the world would send money to keep them afloat, to ensure that Jewish presence in our homeland will remain. This kind of question, Oliver, erases the Jewish identity, and you should not give it legitimacy.
Because there were already people living there.
The people that the Palestinians have to blame for that are Muhammad and his followers. When the Muslims conquered the land of Israel in the 7th century AD, they could have done what Cyrus did in the 6th century BC, or what the Brits did in 1917, announce that they are giving the land back to the Jews. But they didn't do that, because they were imperialists. The Arab way was to erase every nation that they conquered and turn them all into part of the Arab nation. And they succeeded all across the Middle East, but the Jewish national identity was too strong and did not yield. Well, when you colonize other people's land, you are taking the risk that one day those indigenous people will be strong enough and take their land back. Yeah, it sucks for the Arabs who were living in the land of Israel at the time, but they have only their ancestors to blame.
Because there were already people living there and you can't just kill them, I mean...
Nobody had to be killed. The local Arabs were, and still are, perfectly welcome to become part of the Jewish nation. See, if they had their own country before that, you would have a point. If there was a state called Palestine, in which Jews were Palestinian citizens, you could say that Israel was built on someone else's land. But the Arabs living in the Holy Land were citizens of the Ottoman Empire, and now they are citizens of Israel. They lost nothing, and if they accepted it peacefully, no one would have died. But they chose war instead, and in war, people are killed. The Arabs continued to refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist, and that refusal led to a few more wars, in which they always suffered a humiliating defeat. Finally, in the late 1980s, the Palestinian leadership realized that it had to face reality, and signaled its willingness to make peace. This was immediately reciprocated by Israel, and the peace process was launched. The Israeli right wing argued against it, claiming that the Palestinians were colonizers in this country, and therefore have no claim to it. The Israeli left wing argued that the Palestinian national identity was born in the land of Israel, and therefore the Palestinians are also indigenous to this land, and have national rights here. The left won the debate, and Israel is prepared to give up a chunk of the Jewish homeland as part of the two-state solution. Unfortunately, there have been some other developments. First, the rise of Islamism and jihadism in the Muslim world, which makes the Arabs think that with religious zeal they can achieve the old dream of destroying Israel. Secondly, the rise of antisemitism in the Western left, especially in the academy. Postmodern historians believe that they have the right to just invent narratives that support their political agenda, and they've rewritten the history of the Jewish-Palestinian conflict. First, they rewrote the history of what happened in 1947, describing the Jews as the aggressors. But that's nothing compared to the bigger crime, which is trying to erase the Jewish story and make it seem like it is the Palestinians who are the indigenous people of this land, whereas the Jews are the colonizers.
Israel was created because nobody would take in the Jews during the Holocaust.
This is one of the most popular anti-Semitic lies. Leftist anti-Semites want to make it seem like the Jews have no nationality and no claim to the land of Israel. So they portrayed the Jews as a religious group which was persecuted, prompting the world, in its mercy, to give them land in some randomly selected place, which happened to be an existing country called Palestine. When it is portrayed in this manner, Israel is made to be founded upon an injustice, and the Palestinians, seeing that many people in the West now think that way, have backed away from the two-state solution and once again want to destroy Israel. And so, we are back in a state of war. This is what it did to the Palestinians. In the West, this lies the basis for left-wing antisemitism.
And so when I see Israel institute law that recognizes it as a Jewish state and does not recognize the other religions that are living in it, and we still uphold it as a democracy in the Middle East, I almost chuckle, because I know that if we see that in any other society, we would criticize it, we would call it out. We do that to Iran, we do that to any other place that sort of upholds its religion.
Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, and this is meant in the national sense. Israel is the Jewish state in the same way that the US is the American state and France is the French state. It has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. You can be of any religion or of any race and still belong to the Jewish nation. Those Ethiopians that we mentioned earlier, who are not Jews when they immigrate to Israel, become Jews once they integrate in Israeli society and are part of the nation. So there is no discrimination in the Israeli law against people who are not Jews by faith. But anti-Semitic propaganda is erasing the Jewish national identity, and describes Jews as either a religion or a race. This allows them to then claim that the definition of Israel as a Jewish state is discriminating against other religions or races. It's hard to blame Representative Ilhan Omar for her ignorance. She is the product of decades of anti-Semitic propaganda. But the fact is that the US Congress now has members like her, who are spouting anti-Semitic rhetoric such as this. This is what left-wing antisemitism has wrought, and we've already discussed what it leads to. When people are led to believe that Israel is like Iran, and yet they see that the American government and media are treating it like a democracy, they can then jump to the conclusion that the Jews secretly control the government and the media. And so, they go down the path that leads to neo-Nazism. So, to resist antisemitism, you first of all have to know the basic Jewish story, which I just told. This story is based in historical facts. Now, these are not all the facts, of course. I picked the facts that support the Jewish story. There are other historical facts, and you can use them to present counter-arguments to the Israeli positions. But to do it fairly, you have to first of all acknowledge the facts that I mentioned, and acknowledge the Jewish national identity. And secondly, you have to base your counter-arguments on actual facts, not on made-up facts. Unfortunately, and again, the left carries a lot of the blame for this, today people believe that they can just invent narratives and treat them as truth. One place where we see it is Black American antisemitism. I mentioned this type of antisemitism in the beginning of the video, and some of you might be wondering what this is all about, since this is a type of antisemitism that isn't discussed much. The origin of this type of antisemitism is in a group of Black Americans who believe that the biblical Jews were black, and that they are the true descendants. This belief has been around for more than a century, and it has several variations. The anti-Semitic variation claims that, at some point in history, a group of evil people stole this identity from the blacks, and that today's so-called Jews are the descendants of this diabolical group. And so, they hate the Jews. This group used to be marginal, but lately, there have been developments. Many black people today believe that the original Egyptians, those who formed the earliest human civilization, were blacks, and that the white people robbed them of that birthright. And so they are also prone to accept the idea that they were the original Jews, and today's Jews robbed it from them. None of this has any basis in historical facts, but this doesn't matter nowadays. And it doesn't matter, in large part, because the left has promoted the idea that minorities can advance any narrative that they want, and we all have to accept it as true. The result is the rise of anti-Semitism in the Black American community. Before the current pandemic, there were daily stories of Jews being attacked by blacks in the streets of New York, including murders. Before I'm done, I'll just mention that we are now detecting the rise of a new form of antisemitism, AI antisemitism. The YouTube algorithms are constantly removing videos made by Jews in which they speak up against antisemitism. I am sure that the intentions are good, and the aim is to prevent antisemitism from being propagated on the site. But, as we saw in that Young Turks video, it is very easy to propagate antisemitism in a way that isn't detected by the robots. When you want to speak up against antisemitism, on the other hand, you have to spell things out, and this triggers the censorship. It's not just on YouTube, it's on other social networks as well. YouTube often states that they want to create a welcoming environment for all people. Well, it is not a welcoming environment for Jews at the moment. If you think that trying to erase antisemitism from your site is what makes it welcoming, you are gravely mistaken. You are not going to fool me into thinking that antisemitism does not exist. I know it's out there, and I want to see it. Among other things, it helps me understand the enemy that I am fighting. I am glad that videos like that Young Turks video are still up, because it helps me explain to other people what antisemitism is. But what makes me feel very unwelcomed is when I put a lot of work into a video like this, and then it gets removed. It's basically YouTube telling me that I am allowed to be a Jew on their site, but only as long as I know my place and don't speak up against those who hate and persecute me. It's a boot on my face. Oliver, I hope that this video stays up long enough for you to watch it. If any of you guys want to make a mirror of this video, I welcome it. Help me spread it around. At least in the Western world, antisemitism is still weak and can be kept at bay. But the alliance of anti-Semitic forces is on the march. Educating yourself, and others, is how we can defeat it.